Imagine a ruler who forces senators to run barefoot alongside his chariot. A man who declares war on the god of the sea and orders his legions to collect seashells as war trophies. An emperor who feeds his horse golden grains and prepares him to become consul of Rome. His name was Gaius Caesar Caligula, and in 4 years he turned the world's greatest empire into a personal arena of cruel games, insane rituals, and public humiliation. This is the story of a time when Rome learned that the only thing more terrifying than an external enemy is its own emperor. Imagine it. A spring morning in Rome. The sun illuminates the marble facades of the Forum, and the streets are buzzing with voices. Senators in purple robes, praetorians in bronze helmets, and crowds of commoners have gathered to see the new ruler. His official name is Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, a member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. He is the son of the legendary general Germanicus, beloved by the legions and the people, and the great-grandson of the first Roman emperor, Octavian Augustus. As a child, accompanying his father on military campaigns, he wore small soldier's boots, Caligula, for which the legionaries jokingly nicknamed him Caligula, meaning, little boots. This nickname stuck so well that it became known throughout the empire. In our story, we will continue to call him Caligula, so as not to confuse him with his distant relative Gaius Julius Caesar, who was killed during the Republic. Today, Rome is celebrating. A new emperor ascends the throne after the gloomy and alienated reign of Tiberius. The first weeks of his reign are like a breath of fresh air. He declares an amnesty, releases those who were unjustly convicted by his predecessors from prison. He reduces taxes and returns confiscated estates to their owners. In honor of his accession, he organizes spectacles that Rome has not seen in a long time: chariot races, gladiator fights, theatrical performances, and even staged naval battles. In the first months of his reign, he even ordered special baskets of food and gold coins packed in small clay amphorae to be distributed to the crowd so that people would remember from whom they had received the gift. This gesture was reminiscent of the traditions of Octavian Augustus, but it also had a political subtext: buying loyalty. The people applauded, the Senate flattered him, and the legions swore allegiance. It seemed that a new golden age had dawned. But those who were more attentive noticed the first strange notes in his behavior. Caligula loves to make sharp jokes about senators, laughs at their speeches, and forces them to repeat their oaths just for his own amusement. At banquets, he always finds a way to be the center of attention, even if it humiliates distinguished guests. So far, it looks like the whims of youth, but a shadow is already beginning to fall on his image. In the fall, when the heat subsides and the first cool air appears in the Forum, the emperor suddenly disappears from public events. Official heralds speak of temporary weakness, but soon alarming rumors begin to spread throughout the city: Caligula is dying. He is in a fever for weeks, and even the palace doctors cannot predict the outcome. The palace is filled with a depressing silence. The praetorians standing at the gate whisper, as if any loud sound could cut short the emperor's life. Servants carry jugs of water and clay bowls with infusions to reduce the fever. The emperor lies in semi-darkness, the autumn wind howling outside the shuttered windows. Several times he is given sacred amulets, some from the temple of Jupiter, others from private collections. Senators send gifts, and the streets near the palace are crowded with people praying. Rome is divided between those who sincerely fear losing him and those who already imagine a new struggle for power. Each new day without official news is like a small crack in the imperial facade. When he finally comes out to the people, everyone sees his pale face, his noticeably thinner figure, but also a smile that tries to convince them of his strength. And yet something has changed. Those who knew him a few months ago note that his gaze has changed: it is longer, more alert, sometimes even cold. His recovery does not bring the relief that was expected. On the contrary, it is as if he has lost his former lightness along with his illness. He begins to make decisions abruptly and without hesitation, even in areas where he used to consult others. His jokes now make only those who understand laugh, because it is dangerous not to laugh. His desire to be the center of attention turns into a demand for worship. What began as dawn is now slowly but surely darkening, as if before a storm. After his illness, new, previously unnoticed trait appears in Caligula's behavior. He looks at the world as if he has discovered something that others are incapable of understanding. In the first months of his recovery, he still appears at games, visits the Senate, smiles, but no longer tolerates arguments and poorly hides his irritation when someone reminds him of tradition. Gradually, an idea emerges that at first sounds like a joke but quickly becomes an official demand. He is not just an emperor, but the embodiment of divine power. Caligula orders statues of himself to be erected in all the main temples of the empire, alongside Jupiter, Mars, and Venus. For the Romans, who were accustomed to revering deceased emperors as gods but never equating a living ruler with the immortal, this seems disturbing. In temples throughout Italy, craftsmen replaced the faces of the gods with those of the young emperor, and in the provinces, especially in the east, this new form of worship developed even faster. There, people were already familiar with the idea of a divine monarch. One of the most famous examples of the new religious policy is the temple in Miletus, where priests had to make sacrifices not only to Jupiter but also to Caligula. In the provinces, this seemed normal, since the cult of divine rulers had existed in the East since the time of Alexander the Great, but for Rome it was a radical innovation. The Senate initially tried to ignore this demand, but Caligula acted in such a way that resistance seemed pointless. At official ceremonies, he began to appear in costumes inspired by images of gods, once in a golden cloak of Helios, another time in a green one, which was worshipped as the color of Venus. Shrines with his own image appear in the palace, and at the entrance to the throne room, people now bow not only to the emperor but also to his statue. The humiliation of the Senate becomes part of daily entertainment. Caligula forces distinguished senators to run alongside his chariot, hold the reins, or brush dust off the spokes of the wheels. At banquets, he demands that they kiss his feet and call him Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Those who dare to show irritation quickly fall out of favor, and some even end up on lists for confiscation of property. The atmosphere in the family also changes. Rumors begin to spread in Rome about his special affection for his sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Livilla, and especially Drusilla. He is not shy about hugging her even during official ceremonies, and when she falls ill, he openly prays for her health in temples as if she were the most precious thing in his life. There are even those who whisper that he calls her his wife before the gods. After her sudden death in 38, he declares Drusilla a goddess and orders senators and the people to make sacrifices to her. Various historical sources describe this relationship differently. Suetonius and Dion Cassius hinted that the affection may have gone beyond normal family feelings, while other authors considered such rumors to be exaggerations or even political slander. Regardless of where the truth ended and fiction began, the very fact of such attention from the emperor caused astonishment and anxiety in Rome. At the same time, a series of public executions began, which broke the old political balance. Under any pretext, wealthy horsemen and senators were executed, and their estates were transferred to the imperial treasury. This was no longer simply punishment of enemies. It was a method of financing personal expenses and grandiose projects that were just beginning to gain momentum. The further it goes, the harder it is to distinguish where imperial power ends and the cult of personality begins. Caligula is no longer just a ruler, he is building himself up as a living god who expects not only obedience but also worship bordering on deification. And the longer this continues, the fewer people in Rome dare to speak differently about him. At the beginning of 40 AD, Rome had already grown accustomed to living under an emperor who recognized no boundaries between power, entertainment, and personal fantasy. But now Caligula decides to extend this game to the entire empire. He announces a grand military campaign to Britain, a distant and not yet completely conquered land. Legions gather provisions and equipment, and provincial cities prepare to send reinforcements. Tension mounts. Britain is a serious challenge, and for many, it is a chance to gain glory. The Praetorians march north, ships are lined up along the coast of Gaul, and shields and spears are already lying on the galleys. And now, when everything is ready, the emperor comes out to the army in full armor, raises his hand, and orders them to collect shells on the ocean shore. "These," he says, "are the trophies of our victory over Neptune, Lord of the Seas." The soldiers, stunned, obediently bend down and fill their baskets with shells, while the officers, gritting their teeth, try to pretend that everything is going according to plan. This scene quickly becomes legendary among the legionaries, first as a joke, and later as a symbol that logic has no power under this emperor. According to some accounts, he brought the shells collected by the soldiers to Rome and displayed them in temples as gifts to the sea god after a victorious campaign. For the senators, this was the final proof that the campaign had no military purpose, but was merely symbolic and theatrical. Caligula's construction projects also took on grotesque proportions. He ordered the construction of giant bridges and canals that had no practical purpose. One of the most famous was a bridge across the Bay of Baiae, made of ships tied together. According to legend, the emperor built it just so he could ride across it in Alexander the Great's armor and prove he could do something no other Roman ruler had ever done. These buildings and projects consumed enormous resources. Senators responsible for finances tried to cautiously hint at the danger, but were met with either ridicule or harsh accusations of treason against the gods. A new era of imperial absurdity is also beginning in the arena. Caligula organizes gladiatorial combats where warriors compete with wooden weapons to spare their lives. But as soon as the audience begins to get bored, he orders the spectators in the front rows to be thrown into the arena, so that blood is where it belongs. This makes attending the games risky even for noble citizens. No one can be sure that today they are just a spectator. With each passing month, it becomes clear that in Caligula's eyes, the state is a backdrop for his experiments. Laws, military campaigns, architecture, even people's lives, everything becomes part of a show in which he is the sole scriptwriter. Those who try to find some political logic in his actions are met with emptiness. His decisions are often made spontaneously, without advisors, guided by whim or a desire to shock. For Caligula, this is not chaos, it is a new form of power, where unpredictability itself is a tool of control. After the war with the sea and demonstrative construction projects, Rome begins to live in an atmosphere where laughter and fear mix into a poisonous mixture. But at the beginning of 41, this balance changes. Caligula, who until recently had been entertaining himself with his whims, now increasingly sees treason around him. The hunt for conspirators begins quietly, with a few arrests in the provinces, explained as suspicion of disloyalty. But very quickly, the scale grows. Any glance, any word could be interpreted as a threat. A senator who did not stand up quickly enough when the emperor appeared, a cohort commander who was too slow to salute, a relative who dared to remind him of traditions, all of them could disappear overnight. Caligula is no longer satisfied with selective punishments. He punishes entire families. Men are removed from the political scene, women and children are sent into exile or left without support. For him, this is not just a reprisal, it is a demonstration that the emperor remembers every insult and knows no bounds in punishment. Military commanders who had recently enjoyed his favor are now also in danger. Several experienced legates are accused of conspiracy and executed without trial, so that even the most loyal remember, no one is so valuable that they cannot be removed. Among the innovations of this period was the so-called marriage tax. Every engaged couple was required to pay a contribution to the imperial holidays. Those who refused risked being placed on the list of disloyal citizens. In the depths of the palace, closed rooms for secret interrogations appeared. It was rumored that the emperor sometimes watched them personally. He could remain in the next room while muffled sounds came from there, as if it were another part of his performance. Servants bringing dishes learned not to look toward the closed doors. The treasury is emptied, and to maintain his lifestyle, Caligula resorts to extremes. He spends money on gold dishes encrusted with precious stones and ships with marble decks and fountains that float on the Tiber like palaces on water. Any resources that can be extracted from the empire are directed toward his personal whims. By this point, Rome has come to understand that the emperor, who until recently considered himself an actor in a grand performance, has now become a director of fear. In this new show, There is no laughter or applause, only silence and waiting for the next scene to end so that they can stay alive. In the spring of 41, Rome witnesses something that just a few years ago would have seemed impossible even in the most vicious satirical plays. Caligula, who loves to mock the Senate, decides to do so in a way that will be obvious to every inhabitant of the empire. His favorite horse, Incitatus, becomes the central figure of a new, political project. First, the emperor orders that he be fed golden grain and water from crystal bowls. Then he builds a marble stable for him with frescoes and servants who fulfill the animal's every whim. Senators summoned to the palace are forced to bow to Incitatus and listen to stories about his statesmanlike talents. When Caligula officially announces that he is appointing the horse as consul, many do not believe that he is serious. But orders to prepare for the ceremony arrive at the Senate office, and there is no room for doubt. This is not a joke or gossip, it is a new political reality. Some of his contemporaries wrote that during banquets, Caligula jokingly consulted Incitatus on political decisions, placing a cup of wine in front of the horse and silently listening to his answer. For the emperor, this was a double pleasure, to emphasize that he could make anyone, even an animal, superior to the senators, and at the same time to show that no tradition was inviolable. The humiliation of Rome became commonplace. In his official speeches, Caligula allowed himself to interrupt senators, insult their families, and ignore ancient laws. He issued decrees that made no sense but demanded strict compliance. One of them ordered that some of the guards in temples be replaced by dancers so that the gods would not be bored. The moral shock affects even those who previously tolerated his whims. During banquets, the emperor indulges in explicit scenes involving noble women and young men, who become part of his entertainment without the ability to refuse. For many, this was humiliating and dangerous, as the emperor saw it as a demonstration of his power. He turns part of the palace into a place for private parties for the upper classes, events that even those who participated in them later preferred not to mention. What was once the imperial court now resembles two things at once, a circus and a trap. Everyone who enters here does not know whether they will leave humiliated, destroyed, or even alive. By the beginning of 41, even Caligula's closest associates live in constant tension. The Praetorians, who are called upon to protect the emperor, see every day how he can destroy a person in an instant for no reason. A joke told in his presence, a casual glance, being late for a ceremony, and a person disappears forever. His paranoia reached such heights that no one knew if they would wake up alive the next day. The emperor could invite you to dinner and order your execution in the morning without any explanation. The Praetorians began to understand that every new day spent with him was a growing risk. A conspiracy is brewing among a small circle of those who were once considered the most loyal. Among them is the Praetorian tribune Cassius Chaerea, who has endured years of humiliation. Caligula mocked him by giving him women's passwords for guard duty and making fun of his voice. For Chaerea, this is not just an insult to his honor, it is a constant reminder that he, a warrior and commander, is worthless to the one he is supposed to protect. The plan is simple: strike when the emperor is without his main guard. The right moment comes on January 24, after the theater games, when Caligula sets off through an underground corridor of the palace. He is accompanied only by a few close associates and a small guard. The atmosphere is relaxed, he is in a good mood after the spectacle and confident that nothing threatens him. The dark stone corridor, whose walls still retain moisture from the winter rains, becomes the place where history takes a sharp turn. Chaerea approaches, pretending to whisper something, and strikes first with his dagger. Caligula manages to scream, but the other conspirators are already there, blows rain down from all sides. He tries to break free, but the narrow passage leaves no room for escape. It all happens in a matter of seconds. The conspirators surround him, and he has no chance of escape. The screams and commotion quickly subside, leaving only the cold silence of the corridor. The emperor, who just a few minutes ago was confident in his power, now lies motionless on the stone floor, the purple of his clothes contrasting with the dark stains under the feet of the conspirators. In Rome, the news spreads quickly. Some people rejoice, believing that the reign of terror has finally come to an end. Others whisper silently, fearing that the madness may have left a deeper mark than the dictator himself. Those of you listening to this story may ask, is everything that is said about Caligula true? Did he really appoint his horse as consul, fight the sea, and hold banquets that turned into public humiliation of the nobility? History does not always give us simple answers. Tacitus, one of Rome's most authoritative historians, wrote about his cruelty and madness, but he did so cautiously. Some of his writings about Caligula were probably destroyed or lost. Suetonius, in his The 12 Caesars, paints a picture of a ruler who began with mercy and ended in a whirlwind of sadism and contempt for all laws. Dio Cassius adds that some stories about him were exaggerated by his enemies, but admits that his rule became an example of how quickly absolute power can turn into absolute chaos. There are contradictions among the sources. For example, some believe that the story with Incitatus was a joke, while others believe that it was a real act of humiliation of senators. Some said that the war with the sea was a symbolic act, others that it was literal and that soldiers actually collected shells as trophies. But even if half of these stories are exaggerated, the atmosphere of fear and mockery, confirmed by many eyewitnesses, remains undeniable. After his death, the Senate tried to erase the name of Gaius Julius Caesar Caligula from memory, to ban any mention of him, destroy his statues, and annul his decrees. But time works differently. They banned his name, but not his memory. And the more they tried to erase him, the more stories appeared, terrible, wild, sometimes absurd. For some, he remained a monster, for others, a warning. A warning that even the most beloved ruler can turn into a caricature of himself in a few years if his power is unlimited. That power without control and moral constraints is capable of tearing apart the very fabric of the state. And perhaps the greatest horror lies not in the fact that Caligula considered himself a god, but in the fact that for a time, everyone around him pretended that it was true.